Good morning. Thank you all so much for being here. It's exciting to interview this incredible woman who I've known for a very, very long time because we're not going to age ourselves. Charlotte, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's really an honor to have you here with me today. And I always kind of wanted to sort of how are you feeling today? How's your heart?
Well, first, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here this morning. I love that question because I think it's asked, I know, by you with intention, and you're holding space for me to really give a real answer. I feel great today, actually. Despite the rain. I was just in LA, and one of the things I'm really intentional about is leaning into the things that bring me joy. And this is outside of just what I do day to day, but one of the things I do that I'm really passionate about is I collect art. So I went to the Frieze Art Fair in LA, and I had a little gathering for women in the arts, which was cool. And then I'm really intentional about backing artists who are underrepresented. And so there's a woman she's 65, her name is June Edmonds, and she has this incredible practice that I feel has really kind of been left out of the conversation. So I had a group of people come, including a museum trustee, to see her show in LA. And I bought a piece from her opening, so that was great. And then I missed my flight to New York. But I'm here, so I feel good.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, I wanted to kind of get a sense of can you share a moment in time where you used your access, your power, and your privilege to challenge the status quo, in addition to that, to create systematic change?
Yeah, I love that question, but I want to take a little bit of a step back. I think it's important to really think about the entire arc, right, of my career before I get into the moment that would be more recent. I've done a number of things, and sometimes when I tell people about my career journey, they try to piece it together, and they're like, it doesn't make sense. But for me, it really has, because it's really been guided by some core questions. So I came out of Wellesley College, and I first did Teach for America. And then I, in the classroom, realized that I came here to kind of deal with something that I was really interested in, like how is education a driver for, or not a driver for, making the world more equitable? And I quickly realized that the factors that really drove the success of the students in the classroom had little to do with sometimes what I was doing. So for example, even though this was third grade, students would come in hungry, they would come in and they would talk about living in shelters, and they would come in and they would sometimes talk about substance abuse that they were witnessing. So there was all these economic related factors that had nothing to do with the classroom. And so from that, I decided that I wanted to get to the core of what are these macro kind of issues at play that are impacting the students that I teach. And at first I thought I'd work in local government, but very quickly I ended up moving to DC to work as a policy advisor on Capitol Hill. Ultimately worked for 4 members of Congress, including Senators Chris Murphy and Cory Booker. And the core questions that kind of driven both of those kind of points in my life and ultimately led me to business school, to work in finance, and finally to found a startup, and then to ultimately kind of come to this seat, have all been about how is our pie kind of how is the economic pie kind of set? What are the slices that are kind of divvied out, and who gets what slice, and what does that mean and why, and how do you change that? For example, when I worked for Senator Booker, he was on the Committee for Small Business and Entrepreneurship, and I had been an entrepreneur coming out of business school, and it was really fascinating to me to look at how do we actually increase the founders who are getting funded in New Jersey. You can imagine Jersey doesn't necessarily get the love that New York gets. And so we did a lot of things to try to attract VCs into New Jersey, to get startup accelerators started, right? Because founders who live outside of hubs like New York or Silicon Valley, and I know you all are nodding as you understand this, don't necessarily get the same sort of access and opportunities. So this has been an overarching arc, a thread throughout everything I've done, essentially. What is, who has access, who doesn't, how do we change that, how do I play a role in changing some of that? And so the moment I would focus on has actually been in at Amazon. So in 2020, I was watching what was happening around the country, definitely personally impacted by seeing what had happened in terms of George Floyd and so many of the other, Ahmaud Arbery, the things that were happening. And I wanted to figure out what role do I play in that? What responsibility do I have? And there were a lot of internal conversations. I was being asked, and sometimes I don't know if that sometimes is also an uncomfortable position to be put in, right? It's here, solve this for us. But there were a lot of questions around what can Amazon do to increase equity? And the conversations I thought were centered on things that were interesting or important, like police reform. But I fundamentally felt like what we understood really was technology. So why not take what we really understand, like building technological businesses and helping founders around the world do a better job of that and provide resources in a more equitable way? And so I raised my hand and decided that what I could do to be a part of the solution there was to create a team with a singular focus on accelerating underrepresented founders and investors. And so I did that. And since then, it's been about 3.5 years. I created a team that really focuses on programs and partnerships that move the needle for founders. And then I've also played a role in the creation of a fund of funds internally. It's a $150 million fund of funds that writes checks to the funds that gets capital in the hands of underrepresented founders.
That's impressive, and I saw the work that you did firsthand in Lagos. I think it was about 2 years ago when your entire team came down when you launched AWS in Africa. So congratulations on raising your hand and pushing initiatives like that globally.
Yeah, it's been a lot. It's a lot of travel as well. Because of our global footprint, I felt really committed to the fact that this couldn't just be work that was done in the U.S., that it had to matter in other parts of the world. So I've been a sponsor to a number of things like Africa Arena across the continent. Last year I was in Egypt, I was in Kenya, Ghana, I've lost track, Senegal, lots of different places. And also in India, we did 2 incredible forums for women founders in Bangalore and Delhi. And I've learned a lot also too across these different spaces. It's been fascinating to have one-on-one conversations with founders in different parts of the world, particularly women. That's been a big focus in some of these other markets, to really figure out like what really moves the needle there, and to make sure that we're localizing the programs that we create so that they're relevant wherever we are. Yeah.
So in your role, how do you balance what the enterprise priorities? So AWS has their goals, they have their priorities, and then from your perspective, how do you make sure you are supporting the founders and creating that sort of the equilibrium and that balance? How do you do that in your role?
Yeah. So I saw that question. I was like, I mean, to be honest, I'm going to be really candid. So there have been times when I've just said simply no. I remember a year into this work, feeling some pressure because there were, sometimes there are senior people who have a different perspective, and sometimes I just had to say no. I think that the way that you might want to push what it is I'm leading or what your thoughts are just don't make sense, and here's why. And I mean, I back that up with data. I back that up with kind of qualitative takes from founders. Of course, everything at Amazon is centered on the voice of the customer, so that's a great way to sort of anchor those kinds of conversations. But it has meant oftentimes that I've had to sort of advocate for the work that I'm doing, even internally, because there is sometimes, especially as you've seen across tech in recent years, there's been a pushback in some ways across not just DEI, but I mean, we've seen layoffs, we've seen lots of different things, cost cutting. So I've had to have some tough conversations at times. But I think I'm just, I'm super committed to the work, and I do have a lot of buy-in. That I don't say this to mean that everyone is somehow trying to get rid of the work that I'm doing. There is a lot of buy-in across different orgs. And I think because I have been thoughtful about building that buy-in, it makes those conversations less easier. Yeah. And when I talk about buy-in, if you're someone in the audience who is doing similar work or in a similar organization, I've been thoughtful about creating a kind of network of collaborators across all of Amazon's companies. So sometimes when I look for resources or I look for backing, it's not just within Amazon Web Services. I'll talk to our corporate affairs team. I'll talk to .com or transportation, literally anywhere where I find someone who can be a collaborator and a conspirator on the work that I'm doing, and that's been really helpful.
So for the women in here, as you mentioned, so besides getting buy-ins, what else can you actually do? I think for some of us it's very easy to say no, just because that's just the essence of who we are, but not everyone has that in them. So what advice can you give from folks who are trying to do it within their organizations to where they're leading?
Yeah, I don't think it's easy to say no, actually. Yeah, I actually think it's quite hard. I think it's quite hard when your boss is do it this way, and you're actually, I'm not going to do that. So that was fun. I think that's hard. I think that's come, one, I've thought a lot about this, like what makes what I term this, or the way that I think about this, is like small acts of courage, right? Because we think about courage as like a big word. Like we think about it sometimes in historical context or in the context of like figures who do things. But sometimes it can feel pretty brave to stand up at a meeting and say, actually, I think we should do something completely different. Or to say, like, hey, I just want to finish my point. Like that takes like stiffening your backbone a little bit. And I think some of that just comes with practice. Like the more that you dig a little deeper and resist, the more you dig a little deeper and are able to kind of pull from within to offer your perspective in moments that may not feel opportune, I think the more that you do that, the more that it becomes easier to do it. I think how do you get there though? For me, it's been really getting comfortable with a grounding in what I have to offer. So one of the things that I really decided for myself very early on in my career was that regardless of what room I'm in, I have something to offer. So I just have this foundational and really fundamental belief, it really, at this point, that's unshakable, that regardless of who's sitting on the other side of the table for me, that I have a perspective and I have experience that will benefit whatever it is that we're working on or whatever plan. And I think that if you're really grounded in who you are and what you bring to the table, and I don't think it just has to come from experience. Like you can have that same sort of grounding. There may be a woman in the audience who's in her 20s or who's early in her journey as a founder. It could be, you could start even earlier, a grounding in sort of like what your parents or what your community deposited in you. Whatever those roots are, like dig them deep and hold on to them. And I think that that is a part of what I do that's really important. Yeah.
So I always think about what inspires me. It's like, I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, which is a crazy city. However, when you think about entrepreneurship, when you think about the hustle, the grit, the resilience of women, I have no reason not to be able to do what I'm trying to do in life. So you're born in Atlanta, and Atlanta is a city that was at the forefront of civil rights movement. Born and raised, generations, you've been there. How has that informed how you see advocacy, how you see access, how you see equity as well too? So how does like your family, your environment, how did that inform who you are, the woman that you've blossomed into today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because there is a way in which there's a living history that you just take for granted maybe sometimes in Atlanta. And I say that because I grew up, you go to an event and Coretta Scott King was there, or Andrew Young is like there, or Hosea Williams, or Julian Bond. They're all types of people who you just happen to meet, right? Because Atlanta, especially in, let's say, the 90s or early 2000s and late 80s, was a much smaller place. Some people in the audience, if you live in New York, you still think it's a small place. But it was a much, much smaller place then. And so there was a way in which that history of the civil rights movement was very tangible. So you'd go to a place like, there's a place in Atlanta called Pascal's, which was an organizing center for people like Martin Luther King and others who were part of the civil rights movement. Pascal's is still a restaurant that you can go have dinner in, and as you go into Pascal's, there are like photos sometimes that line the walls and tell the story of that time. So I think that living history certainly sort of impacted me kind of growing up. You're very aware of it. It's not something that you're learning from history books. It's both kind of living a lived experience as well as conversations kind of with family. I think what kind of, that's the sort of like city piece of it. I think the familial piece is, my mom and I have had a lot of conversations about her and my aunt integrating their high school. Like I think that there's a way in which, again, the history is just sort of lived. And then one of the things that was really kind of important to me that we've talked about is just like shared family stories. Like one of the stories that we tell a lot in our family is about a matriarch whose name is Antonia Newman. She was born a slave and she became an entrepreneur. And my family still owns land that she happened to buy from the money that she made from a store that she set up. And I think when I think about that story, both growing up and then also think about it now, to me what that says is that legacy is really important, that the decisions that we all make today can have an impact generations ahead, and that entrepreneurship has the power to do that. So I often, I wasn't necessarily talking about that publicly, right? it just didn't occur to me like to something that I'd wanted to share or that seemed relevant.
Yeah.
But I was asked last year in Kenya, I was on a panel and asked about sort of the matrilineal thread in my family around entrepreneurship, and that's certainly kind of the strongest one. My sister is named after Antonia. It's definitely a story that we tell a lot, and I think a lot about her. I have a photo of her and that and other people from that sort of era in my family that I look at quite often, because I think it's a reminder of just the power of the decisions I make in real time, and then also sort of the legacy of the sacrifices and decisions that were made before me.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that family background. So as you advocate for yourself and others, especially over the last 4 years, how do you think about the notion of agency? And feel free to go into sort of the timeline, if you,
So, we're I think over the course of the conversation so far, we've talked a lot about some pieces of this that factor into how I think about agency. Certainly small acts of courage is a part of it. I think another piece of it is also just equipping yourself. So equipping yourself could look like being educated on your rights, or it could be like really understanding kind of the space that you're in. When Ina's referencing the last 4 years, a part of what she's referencing is not just my day-to-day work at Amazon Web Services, but also the fact that I chose to really come forward and speak about being sexually harassed at work and experiencing discrimination based on race and gender. And I also chose to file a lawsuit. And this has been a public fact, so I don't mind kind of talking a little bit about here. I think that agency, again, and even kind of reaching a place where I felt comfortable coming forward with some of the things I experienced, a lot of that, again, was just like starting from a place of fundamentally, like, who am I, right? Like, who was I both kind of reared to be? What are all these influences that we've talked about that have sort of shaped me? And then also, not just about, it wasn't just, agency really isn't, I don't think about it just in an individualistic sense, right? I think we draw a sense of agency from a collective, right? From community. I'm a big believer in sort of both small communities, like the women who are peers of mine, like Aina, who really inspire me, but also a big believer in kind of broader sets of communities and what that means. And so I think that it's not just kind of digging from within, but it's also finding kind of that sense of community from others. For me, like, why I chose to do something that was really tough and advocate for myself in that sense was in part because I was like, well, what would I want other women to do if in the same seat? And what will this decision mean for other women, both at Amazon and tech? And I think that it has mattered. Sometimes I get lots of notes from people in the U.S. and also from around the world sometimes who come across my story, and they find some bit of power for themselves in that, or they find some lesson that they're able to abstract. Or in some cases they say, hey, I think I had an easier time because of what you did. That I think my hiring process was different, or I think that I'm seeing kind of policies change at the company in ways that they wouldn't have if you hadn't said something. So I think that you can define it in lots of different ways, but those are some of the factors that I think about when you kind of mention that word. Yeah.
And where do you find that inner voice? Like, how do you not just find it, but also speak out? And I think one of the things that I've said throughout the years that I've known you for a number of years now, but when this whole thing was happening, I'm like, how do you show up to work every day?
Yeah. I get asked that a lot. Because people, sometimes it just blows their mind. It's like, okay, let me understand this. So you're both suing the company because of what you've experienced, but you also still work there.
Yeah.
Like, what is that like?
Yeah.
I think I think about persistence a lot too, right? And that persistence sometimes isn't a loud thing. Sometimes, like, persistence is like the stream that kind of cuts through rock. I think that for me, a lot of times it's just a daily habit of just continuing. Like a lot of these things that seem, again, like these like heavy lifts or big words, a lot of it is just like a day by day continuous kind of activity. And for me, it's like, it's been important to persist. The thing that I feel very strongly is that if something happens to you that's outside of your control, right? and oftentimes inherently harassment or other things like that. It's outside of your control. Like it's not something that you've brought onto yourself. This is some outside actor doing something to you. What I decided for myself was that I absolutely did not want my trajectory at the company or my decision to leave to be the result of someone else's actions that are like outside of like me, right? And so I felt very strongly about that. And I think there was a part of me also that much of this was happening, kind of coming together around the same time that I started the work that I was doing. And I felt really passionate about it. And I was like, why would I leave? Why should I go? Like, they're still here. Like, why would I be kicked out? And I just wanted to make a point around the fact that I think so often things like this are so quiet. There's a way in which you're made to feel like you're the holder of some secret and you should be embarrassed by it. You shouldn't talk about it. And in most cases, people accept sometimes, and I'm not sort of, belittling this because people make all kinds of decisions that make sense for them and their families. But sometimes people accept, they'll accept like a, I don't know, can't think of the word for it right now, but some amount of money to just basically walk away quietly. And I felt a severance or something but I felt very strongly that that's not what I wanted to do. That like, who does that benefit? Like my silence doesn't benefit me, certainly. It doesn't benefit other women. It doesn't benefit employees of color who've been impacted. And so I've decided to be not necessarily loud per se, but I've just decided to speak up where I feel like it's impactful and necessary. And I think I want to be mindful also about context here, because there may be some people in the room who are like, okay, I get this, it makes sense. But maybe others are like, how does this matter for me, or what does this mean? Having been a founder and now talking to founders all around the world, I often find that particularly women are often sometimes in a context where they'll have to deal with either in a pitch a question they're not expecting, or deal with dynamics with their board or executives that they didn't anticipate. There are all kinds of ways that I think if you are a woman or you're from another group that might be historically sort of underrepresented, that there may come a time when you have to speak up for yourself. That could be around, it could be around pay, it could be around equity, it could be around your continuance in your position. And so I think very early on in your journey, whether you're a founder in the room or you're an investor in the room, getting to a place where you have this fundamental rooting that I was talking about, an understanding of who you are, what you bring to the table, and really equipping yourself. So this goes back to like, what do I mean by equipping? I remember talking to a friend who was pushed out by her board, and she was just unfamiliar with like the fact that sometimes you'll end up in situations that happen so quickly, it's almost like hard to act, right? I now fundamentally believe, and I was talking about this off stage, that for many women, when you go into seats of power, you need to be equipped beforehand, and equipped in ways that we wouldn't have anticipated before. Having worked a little bit in politics, or maybe a lot of it, I think that you should have some savvy around, like, let's say you have to go testify before Congress, have some savvy around, like, how does that work? And I'm thinking a little bit about Claudine Gay and kind of invoking that. You should have some sense of, like, who would I call if I need a crisis comms person? Do I know someone who knows a crisis comms executive? But sometimes, like, literally, you'll be dealing with minutes or hours, not weeks or months, right? So let's say you have to figure out how to keep, like, let's say you've started a company, it's gone well, you've gone through Series A, Series B, and you're dealing with a situation where you don't have, 30 days, like you have to figure something out in 24 hours. And so I would say, like, it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily have someone on retainer, but just have some sense of, like, if I was blindsided by something internally or blindsided by something, whether it's coming from someone who is an executive at the company that I've built, or whether it's coming from a board member, how would I act very quickly? And I don't think you have to think in a lot of detail around this, but just have some sense of like what you would do, and have at least some folks saved in your phone who maybe do crisis comms, maybe a lawyer who kind of navigates and understands like how to deal with issues like this. So you're not kind of found like flat-footed. that you kind of are already able to be a little bit in the offensive. And I think this is going to become increasingly important. That's been my sense from my own kind of trajectory and just watching some of the things that I've seen play out sort of in recent months. I think that to be in key positions going forward is going to require a different level of savvy.
I always advise people that, even founders, and personally, I'm like, who's on your personal board of directors? Who are you calling for? It might be something that's so little, so small. And I'm very fortunate to have 4 sisters who are just badasses, friends like Charlotte, who I'm like, okay, I'm going through X, Y, and Z. Who am I calling? Am I thinking about this the right way? So I think it's imperative for you to kind of consider that in your own personal life as well. Yeah.
No, I get a lot of questions on, I have a list of lawyers that I send people. I have a list of reporters. I have, it's like if you are dealing with a situation that, I mean, it could be all number of things, right?
Yeah.
But something that requires both, a degree of PR, legal, crisis kind of savvy. I've definitely become that person to my network, which I'm happy to be. I graduated from Harvard Business School, and one of the conversations that I've had with some of the alumni is that none of us were prepared for scenarios I don't even know what to call them, but scenarios that are unanticipated, like the ones that I'm talking about. And so some of what I've done is to try and kind of talk with the alumni group about how do we kind of share this collective knowledge? I've talked about it a lot with my section mates, but it's been, it's something that you're not really taught, right? Like your career services in college or even in grad school, they don't sit you down and say okay, you might go out there and the unthinkable might happen, right?
Yeah.
Because they want you to, and you rightfully should be anticipating a wonderful career.
World.
That just, where you're blazing paths and, inspiring people. And that can be true, but what also might be true is there could be a moment that you're not anticipating, and how do you account for that, and how do you reach for resources?
Yeah.
So I've talked also with students at my alma mater at Wellesley about it, and I'm really passionate now about the fact that kind of understanding should come a little bit earlier, even if it's just a simple workshop. Just how do you go about preparing yourself as you enter into a new job?
Yeah.
I was just speaking at Spelman College in Atlanta a little bit about this. To be excited, still keep that sort of, optimism that fuels you in your 20s.
Delusional, I think that's a thing.
Stay a little delusional.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah,
don't they say that about entrepreneurs? We're all kind of a little delusional.
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah.
But I think at the same time, be a little more prepared as well. So it's, whatever it is, and I don't know if that, I know if that sounds, if people are, I hope I'm being concrete enough that people understand, but it's just, I'm being a bit sort of open-ended because it may not be a board scenario, it may not be harassment, it might, it could be any number of things.
It could be anything.
Just a challenge to your position and your power, how do you deal with that?
So through your role, and you've been a former founder as well, and I think you're an entrepreneur, I would say the way you navigate the world. For those who are building, while you're building, how do you create opportunities for other people while you're sort of heads down? How do you build and scale still as a founder, making sure you're creating opportunities for other people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I know that for some founders, it's just sometimes it's a challenge to do basic things, go take care of yourself, go work out, right? So I'm mindful of that in answering the question. I want to be realistic about what's possible. I mean, I think first, take care of yourself. It's the whole thing about putting on your oxygen mask first. I think that's important. So I really encourage people to figure out that first. Do you have a self-care routine that makes sense? I'm a big proponent of acupuncture. That woman, if I were ever really fabulously wealthy, you know how you hear about these celebrities who have an entourage that has random people who do things. I would definitely have my acupuncturist travel with me because it just, this is not what you asked me, but I think that first take care of yourself. First take care of yourself. Be very clear on whatever your self-care routine is. Be mindful of preserving your joy. That's the art piece that I was talking about. And then, of course, at the core of all of this is the work that you're doing. It's what you're building. But in order to do that well, I think these other things have to be in place. And then if all of that is together and you're like, I have a little bit of time, I do think community is really important in ways that we don't talk about sometimes in forums like this. But one of the things that I focused a lot on in my role is helping founders to build community, especially coming out of the pandemic. I think a lot of people were very isolated, and there's all kinds of data that shows that we live increasingly pretty solitary lives in a sense. And I think that there's power in community, not just to make us feel better, but I think there's also a lot of learning that can happen between founders being in community. And so I really encourage people to also find peers to really connect with. Like we often see, like let's say, bold names in print and think, oh, I really have to get to that woman or that person because I want to understand their journey. But there's so much power in kind of like peer mentorship and peer sharing. So I think just creating the time to really connect with the people who are sitting next to you today and kind of stay in conversation and having sort of a regular cadence around that I think is important.
And as we wrap up, as you think about your career, what would you have done sooner and or differently?
Wow. Let me think about this. Sooner or differently?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Or no regrets. And that's okay.
Okay, so I'll tell a story. So when I was working for Corey, there was a time when I told him, I was like, Hillary Clinton's going to be elected. Okay, I want to work for Hillary, is what I told him. I was like, I want to work for Hillary. You're going to help me work for Hillary. So that's where we are. And so he started helping me figure out, because in DC, the way the town works is that, as people put as you can imagine, it's like, if you want like a job at Treasury or the White House, this is a multi-month networking process, right? So at the time also, Vernon Jordan was a mentor of mine. And so I sat down with Vernon to talk about, wanting to work for Hillary Clinton. He was, of course, he's passed, and it was a luminary and incredible man, but he was close to Bill Clinton. So we were talking about, I want to work for Hillary. I went to talk to Antonio Weiss, who was then at the Treasury. I planned to come to Treasury, or the NEC. So I think that I laugh about it now because there's all this energy poured into this enterprise of this thing I was kind of building out that was predicated on something that clearly didn't happen. And I think the lesson that I gather from that, one, it's something that Vernon Jordan told me that I think many of you probably have heard before too. Sometimes we're looking at two different things, because I was sitting down with him and I was like, okay, do I go to the corporate world? I am really interested in this kind of intersection between financial services and tech, or do I go into the administration? And he was like, well, there's no wrong choice, right? And I think I wish I had understood sooner that sometimes we create these false pregnant moments for ourselves where it's like there's so much pressure to make a decision and it's not real, right? It's like there's so much pressure that we can apply to ourselves. It's all kind of in our heads. And ultimately, the decision didn't matter because it didn't, whatever path I chose, it would have been fine. Okay. And also, clearly one path didn't materialize. And at some point, I saw Corey recently, but we're gonna sit down soon and probably have a good laugh about that, because I was like, do you remember that? Because I remember him teasing me a little bit about it. Yeah. And I feel like now he'll be like, okay, how did that work out?
How did that work out for you? We
Yeah.
have time for one more question. One question, audience question, possibly two, but we have time for one for sure. Anyone? I saw your hand first.
Really thoughtful conversation. I wanted to ask more in line with the role you've done sooner. So in terms of how you redefine qualitative context, the understanding of professionalism, executive presence, authenticity, how have you pushed those definitions or redefined those to, accelerate access?
Yeah.
So basically, can you ask the question again? Because I have to distill it into one sentence.
How have you redefined, with your experience, the traditional understanding of professionalism
So in the theme of access, advocacy, and what was the other A that we had up there? I can't remember. Acceleration. Sorry. How have you, throughout your career, how have you defined that for yourself and create that opportunity for yourself?
Redefine it beyond the traditional understandings of finance.
That's,
Yeah,
that's a good question,
it
actually.
is a good question. It's like, So the first way I heard the question, the thing I had in mind to respond with is that I remember, when I was at Harvard Business School, I summered at State Street, an asset management firm, and I thought I had to, like I went and bought these like awful Brooks Brothers like button-down shirts, because I was like, God forbid they know I'm a woman, I have to like dress a certain way on the sales and trading floor, or like the gig is up. So I bought this like uniform that I felt I had to wear because it was important to like blend in. And I think there's been this, at different points in my life, that's one point. I can point to moments where I felt like I had to exist in a certain box or to wear a certain costume or uniform, or else I was not a professional, or I wasn't capable, or I didn't know what I was talking about. And I think the thing that I've done, which has been important to myself, and part I've sort of talked publicly about how Corey helped with some of this. It was one of the places I've worked where it didn't matter. I could come in like, I could have on ripped jeans that day, t-shirt. I may have an afro. My nails might be super long, and then Corey would be like, "This is my economic advisor," and it was just like he would put me in situations where it's like literally the CEO of like I went to KKR's board meeting with him, or like I was in all kinds of places in front of like lots of different people, often as the expert, and it kind of developed this sense within myself that like I don't have to wear a costume, like I'm enough, right? However I show up that day, and if the person can't see past, like the jacket that I'm wearing, they won't take what I'm saying seriously, and that tells me a lot about them. And I think I've just tried to create that space for others, like when I'm both like hiring, creating programs, I try to like just create spaces that really allow people to feel a sense of sort of authenticity that I think encourages their own story and their own space. And so I think there's a sort of reciprocal thing that happens, like when we show up kind of fully as ourselves, others feel empowered to do so. I think that has been the way, that's been kind of one of the things that's been really meaningful for me. So. One more question?
One more. Yeah, you can do it.
Fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
I was startled yesterday by seeing discovering a Crunchbase data report that venture capital for underrepresented jobs hit all-time low since 2016, a 73% decrease, and that in 2023, and women of color, in particular, Black female founders and Latinx founders, garnered less than 0.1% of venture last year. We're obviously doing the work, we have the mandates, the money allocated. I love the fund. But what does that mean for your business in the next 24 months?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's why I think you fundamentally have to think about this as an ecosystem challenge, right? Like when I first started doing the work, there was this focus on founders, which makes sense, right? But ultimately, founders receive the capital that they need to build their businesses from a set of GPs. And then often, the funds that write checks to women and write checks to other founders who are underrepresented, there's a certain group of GPs who kind of over-index in that space. And then ultimately, as you go up the pipeline, you're looking at limited partners. And so one of the things that I've started to do is be really thoughtful about this is like not just a problem that exists for founders, but what's happening across the entire ecosystem. Like what role do we play as an LP now? And I think having a fund of funds allows us to exist in spaces as a limited partner and be in conversations around like how do you move the needle at the LP level. Because ultimately, some of the kind of dry up that we're seeing is because there are GPs who aren't getting the capital that they need, right, from LPs. And 2020 not only saw like more checks printing to be founders, it saw new funds being set up. We have to create more capital at the LP level. And I think that this, we're talking about LPs, we're talking about everything from like, teachers' retirement system fund to, family offices. It's like having this conversation can't just exist in rooms like this. And I've been super intentional about that. And it's not, some of it's check writing, and then some of it's just inviting them into the conversation, into the table. One of the things that I did last year that we were really proud of is a program with Harvard Business School, with Harvard Innovation Labs. We brought students from HBCUs and we brought students from Sub-Saharan Africa, and that was funded by the Schultz Family Foundation. And this is sort of, I've tried to think really out of the box about like who comes to the table, because it's not just about like, clearly it was a check that I could have written just out of my own funds, but I wanted to give the Schultz Family Foundation, because they've been doing some check writing on the venture side, exposure to the founders that we're seeing, and also wanted to bring in I'm really a fan of like just not necessarily unlikely collaborators, but collaborators who wouldn't necessarily be at the table. I think we have to expand the conversations that we've been having in forums like this one to ensure that individuals who sit on top of, massive amounts of money, that they become more part of the conversation. So that same end, like I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I've like really dove in with like private wealth teams. I wanted to like really ensure that founders were having an opportunity to expand their networks, right? Because sometimes the challenge is often you're told to go raise capital. Well, from whom, right? If you're, that's one of the things that's been talked about so much in this space is like, how can you raise friends and family capital when you don't have friends and family who can write you a check? And so one of the things that we do is do lots of dinners around the country, inviting people in who are ultra high net worth. So there are a lot, I could go on and on about that, because it's something like long before I think the recent news cycle has started, that I've been really thoughtful about. And I think, sometimes you could say, okay, well, you've been doing that, but this article still came out. It's like, I think it takes a lot of work across lots of different organizations in concert. On top of some of the things I've described, I also sponsor a number of different groups that I think are moving the needle. Black Women in Venture Capital is one of them. I'm really passionate about the idea that you do have to, again, kind of go at this thinking about every single sort of driver within the ecosystem and ensuring that GPs have what they need and LPs are brought into the conversation and realize that their actions have a downstream effect. So.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Charlotte, for being here and saying yes. Thank you.